Hello there, welcome to TCM. I'm Alicia Malone, and tonight's programming is dedicated to director Richard Fleischer. And joining me in studio, which I'm very happy about, is Mark McRae, the author of the book, The Best Saturdays of Our Lives. Hello.
Hi, so happy to be at Turner Classic Movies finally.
Yes.
And co-hosting with the awesome Alicia Malone.
Thank you. I know you're a big fan of TCM, and you're also obviously a big fan of animation. That's what your book is all about, the Saturday morning cartoons and how animation really changed the television industry. So how did your love of cartoons turn into, not only a book, but also a podcast and an entire career?
I've been a big fan of animation for a long time, and I really enjoyed getting up and just watching, my favorite Saturday morning cartoons. And I remember watching a Superman cartoon, just thinking it was a Superman cartoon, and the next thing I know, the Justice League of America shows up, and I was just totally floored. And then much, much later, a series called Josie and the Pussycats premiered in 1970. And I didn't think that this series was going to be great at all. The book itself wasn't really the best comic book seller, but I was just totally blown away by the direction that the Hanna-Barbera team took with the comic book and how they transferred this comic book into a really, really great animated series that had supervillains and espionage and all kind of action. And after that series, I wanted to know more about the world of animation, and I started reading credits and actually calling up the networks to find out if my favorite show would be renewed or canceled.
And then from there you started working in television itself, and you wrote the book. And tonight we're obviously talking about Richard Fleischer, but his father, Max Fleischer, was very involved in animation, a pioneer.
Yeah, Max Fleischer was great animation craftsman. He created a lot of animation innovations, and I think that his studio at the time was probably the only studio that rivaled whatever was going on at the Disney studios around the same time. But Max Fleischer was all about reinvention and trying to keep the audience as entertained as possible with something new going on in animation.
Yeah, so he was involved with rotoscoping, and then also in the creation of Betty Boop and other characters.
Right, the creation of Betty Boop, and then later bringing on Popeye. That was an adaptation from the comic strips. And later, working with DC Comics and Superman shorts, the classic Superman shorts that I just absolutely love.
Yeah, and Max Fleischer, involved in animation. His son, Richard Fleischer, sort of followed his footsteps into film, but not into animation. But he was a really interesting director because he made so many different films throughout his career, from B-movie film noirs, cheaply made but brilliantly made, small budget, to big epics like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and the film we're about to watch, Fantastic Voyage from 1966. This was a film that you chose, so tell us about it.
Okay, so Fantastic Voyage was one of the first films that I remember going to see with my family in a movie theater. And so it always has like a special place in my heart because, when you're a little kid, your parents just take you to the theater. They're not explaining to you that you're going to the movies. At least my parents didn't. They just said, come on, we're going to go see this movie. And I just remember going to the Wakefield Theater in the Northeast Bronx where I grew up and just sitting down and enjoying and watching.
And Fantastic Voyage has such a wonderful cast. We've got Raquel Welch, you've got Arthur Kennedy, Donald Pleasance, Stephen Boyd. What would you like our viewers to look out for?
There is a lot of great special effects in this movie, almost to the point where you might think you're taking an acid trip, but you're not. Yeah, so one of the special things that I think people should look for, they should check out all the technology that they're about to see in the opening credits of this movie. It sort of gives an interesting technology snapshot of what was available at the time or what was available at a future time. Because you're not exactly sure if this story is taking place in the present or in the not too distant future.
That's absolutely correct, and it really sets the tone for the movie. So let's take a look from 1966. This is Fantastic Voyage. That was Fantastic Voyage from 1966, directed by Richard Fleischer. And joining me again in the studio is Mark McRae. So, Mark, this is the type of film where the plot is preposterous, but you completely go with it. And Richard Fleischer shows his skills as a director in making scenes genuinely terrifying, especially the antibodies with Raquel Welch.
Oh, yeah. Well, that is the one scene that I remember from childhood. The antibody scenes where Raquel Welch, her Cora character, gets attacked. And as a kid, it really freaked me out because I didn't know what was going on. And that's the one scene that has always stuck with me from that movie.
Me too. And the corpuscles, you're like, oh no, the corpuscles are coming. But it does give you a little bit of a biology lesson along the way.
I feel like the script actually did a good job in also trying to educate moviegoers about the different functions of the body and just how complicated this operation is, having a submarine in the human body.
Yeah, and much like a voyage to the moon, the voyage inside a human body seems to engender a lot of philosophical questions about the meaning of life and evolution versus creation.
Right. So there's this really great debate between Arthur Kennedy and Donald Pleasance.
Let me know when we pass the soul.
The soul? The finite mind cannot comprehend infinity. And the soul, which comes from God, is infinite.
Yes, but our time isn't.
Debating whether man is God created versus evolution. And they sort of have this debate a couple of times in the movie. And I don't think that it ever gets resolved because there's always some impending danger that comes in and that prevents them from actually arguing who's right.
I mean, that's one of the great things about science fiction is that you can have these bigger conversations. There are a lot of science fiction television shows happening at the same time, also a lot of animation, which you talk about in your book in the late 1960s, including a Fantastic Voyage animated series.
Yes, and so the Fantastic Voyage animated series isn't really talked about a lot. It ran on Saturday morning. It had, some success and also ran in syndication and then sort of disappeared. But the animated series was inspired by the movie. It was done by a company called Filmation Productions. But I interviewed Norm Prescott, who was the executive producer of the series in my book, and he said that they were really trying hard to make the Fantastic Voyage animated series a little bit more kid-friendly. However, it seems as though the network wanted the animation company to stick to the source material. And so you have this Cold War cartoon. They were experimenting. They wanted the Fantastic Voyage cartoon to hopefully skew a little older. And then this way, they may be able to pivot that cartoon to air in primetime television. And I think the hopes were that if Fantastic Voyage brought in enough adults, then they could argue, hey, let's put this cartoon on in primetime and see what it does. I think that was also a goal.
Yeah, did it work?
It did not.
Yeah. But the Fantastic Voyage movie was very successful.
Yes.
So Richard Fleischer, just before Fantastic Voyage, directed 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And that was interesting because that was for Walt Disney, which was a rival to Richard Fleischer's father, Max Fleischer, an animation legend.
Right. Max Fleischer and Walt Disney were definitely rivals. However, I feel that Walt Disney had a certain level of respect for Max Fleischer's work and his animation. Max Fleischer's animation and his innovation cannot be ignored. And I believe because of that, having Richard Fleischer direct 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea wasn't going to be an issue for Walt Disney, because maybe deep down Walt Disney felt that, well, his dad is pretty talented, so I'm sure his son is Richard Fleischer is just as talented.
Yeah.
And so it was probably a no-brainer for Walt Disney.
I know, and I love that Richard Fleischer called his father, Max, just to check that he was okay with him working with Walt Disney, and Max said, yeah, tell Walt that he has great taste in directors. He was very supportive.
Oh, that's awesome.
Thank you so much, Mark McRae.
My pleasure. It's so great to be able to be here, to be a part of TCM and a part of Fleischer Animation's 100th anniversary as well. And it's been a lifelong dream to be able to sit in this chair and to be able to talk movies with a wonderful TCM host like yourself.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And Mark will be back with me after the break to talk about another film directed by Richard Fleischer from earlier on in his career.